7 astronauts, 73 seconds, and a warning that was already on file. Before the Challenger disaster became a national tragedy, it was a bureaucratic argument. The engineers had already raised the alarm. The data existed. The concerns were documented. And yet, on the morning of January 28, 1986, Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off anyway, and 73 seconds later, it was gone. This is not simply a story about a catastrophic engineering failure. It is a story about how warnings travel through organizations, what happens when they meet institutional pressure, and why the people closest to the problem are sometimes the last ones listened to. By the end of this documentary, you will understand not just what destroyed Challenger, but why the system designed to prevent exactly this kind of disaster made it possible instead. To understand what went wrong, you first need to understand what the Space Shuttle program represented. By 1986, NASA was one of the most trusted scientific institutions on the planet. It had carried human beings to the moon. It had demonstrated, repeatedly and publicly, that extraordinary engineering could accomplish what once seemed impossible. The Space Shuttle was the next chapter. Designed to make space access routine, a reusable spacecraft that could launch, return, and fly again, the program promised a new era of reliable human spaceflight. Public confidence was enormous. NASA enjoyed a cultural authority that few organizations have ever matched. When the agency said something was safe, the public believed it, and so, largely, did the government. By January 1986, the program had completed 24 missions, all of which had returned their crews safely, even as engineers quietly documented recurring technical anomalies along the way. The system appeared to be working. But beneath that confidence, something important had been quietly accumulating. The solid rocket boosters that powered the shuttle off the launch pad were manufactured by Morton Thiokol, a contractor based in Utah. Those boosters were assembled in segments, and the joints between those segments were sealed using rubber O-rings, components designed to prevent hot combustion gases from escaping during launch. Critically, those O-rings were designed to seat quickly under launch pressure, but in cold temperatures, they compressed more slowly, meaning the sealing gap remained open longer than the design assumed. Engineers at Morton Thiokol had noticed something concerning. At lower temperatures, those O-rings became less pliable. They sealed less effectively, and flight data from previous missions, including STS-51C, which had launched in cold conditions in January 1985, showed evidence of O-ring erosion on multiple earlier flights. This was not a theoretical concern. It was documented. It was recurring, and it had been absorbed into the program's acceptable risk baseline each time the vehicle returned safely. Roger Boisjoly, a senior engineer at Morton Thiokol, had written an internal memo in July 1985. According to later testimony and the Rogers Commission report, Boisjoly warned explicitly that O-ring failure could lead to catastrophic loss of vehicle and crew. The memo existed. The warning was on file. The system had already told people what was coming. The night before launch, the concern became urgent. January 27, 1986. A teleconference was held between engineers and managers at Morton Thiokol and NASA officials at Kennedy Space Center and Marshall Space Flight Center. The center responsible for managing the solid rocket booster program, and one whose institutional culture the Rogers Commission would later criticize for impeding the upward flow of safety concerns. The forecast for the following morning was unusually cold, temperatures well below anything the shuttle had launched in before. Engineers at Morton Thiokol argued strongly that the launch should be delayed. According to the Rogers Commission, the engineering team presented data showing the correlation between cold temperatures and O-ring damage from previous flights. But investigators later noted that the engineers had focused their analysis on flights that had shown O-ring damage rather than the full dataset of all previous missions. Working under pressure, in real time, they had inadvertently made their already urgent case harder to evaluate statistically. It was not dishonesty. It was the kind of analytical gap that emerges when engineers are placed in the position of arguing against institutional momentum. The recommendation from the engineering team remained clear: do not launch. NASA managers pushed back. The launch had already been delayed. There was institutional pressure to demonstrate that the shuttle could fly on a reliable schedule. Earlier planning projections had envisioned as many as 24 missions per year, an ambition that demanded operational consistency. The engineers had the knowledge. The institution had the authority. Those two things were about to come apart. Morton Thiokol management asked for time off the teleconference. An internal discussion took place. Engineers on one side, managers on the other. According to testimony given to the Rogers Commission, senior management at Morton Thiokol indicated that the decision needed to be treated as a management call rather than an engineering one, a framing that effectively overruled the objections of the technical team. The engineering objections were set aside. Morton Thiokol management approved the launch. NASA was informed. The concerns from the engineers were not formally escalated further up the chain. According to later testimony and interviews, Boisjoly described feeling certain that night that something terrible was about to happen, and that every formal avenue available to him had already been exhausted. The launch was scheduled for the following morning. January 28, 1986. Overnight temperatures had been so severe that ice had formed on the launch structure itself. An inspection team was dispatched that morning to assess the situation. The launch proceeded regardless. Air temperature at Kennedy Space Center at launch time, approximately 36 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest conditions in the program's history. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time, Space Shuttle Challenger cleared the launch tower. 73 seconds later, a catastrophic structural failure destroyed the vehicle. All 7 crew members were lost. The evidence was about to point somewhere the organization had not been willing to look the night before. 7 people were gone. A nation was watching. And the physical answer, when it came, only made the deeper question more urgent. President Ronald Reagan appointed the Rogers Commission within days of the disaster. Formally titled the Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger Accident, it was chaired by former Secretary of State William P. Rogers and included physicist Richard Feynman and former astronaut Neil Armstrong. Investigators examined thousands of documents, reviewed the teleconference records, and interviewed engineers, managers, and NASA officials across the program. The physical cause emerged from the wreckage analysis. An O-ring in the right solid rocket booster had failed to seal in the extreme cold. Hot combustion gases escaped through the joint, burned through the external tank, caused hydrogen to leak and ignite, and the aerodynamic forces ultimately tore the vehicle apart. But the commission was not satisfied with the physical answer. Because the physical answer raised an immediate and uncomfortable question: how had a documented risk been present in the system for years and still resulted in launch approval on the coldest morning in the program's history? The evidence pointed somewhere unexpected. The Rogers Commission concluded that the O-ring failure was the proximate cause, but investigators determined that the root cause was institutional. The commission found that NASA had developed a flawed decision-making process, one in which concerns raised by engineers had not been effectively communicated upward. The organizational structure had created barriers between the people with technical knowledge and the people with launch authority. The commission raised serious concerns about an effectively weakened safety culture, one in which safety offices lacked the independence and authority needed to meaningfully influence launch decisions. Warnings existed within the system. They simply could not travel far enough, fast enough, to reach the people who needed to act on them. Richard Feynman's independent analysis, published as Appendix F of the Commission's final report, was particularly pointed. Feynman concluded that NASA management had been performing a kind of statistical self-deception, treating each flight that returned safely as evidence that the risk was acceptable, rather than as evidence that they had been fortunate. This was the mechanism the investigation uncovered beneath the physical failure. Each time the shuttle flew with evidence of O-ring erosion and returned intact, that outcome was unconsciously absorbed into the acceptable risk baseline. The abnormal became normal. The warning became background noise. Sociologist Diane Vaughan would later name this process the normalisation of deviance in her 1996 study of the Challenger launch decision, a concept that has since entered the vocabulary of risk management far beyond aerospace. The uncomfortable truth was that the system had not malfunctioned suddenly. It had been drifting toward this outcome for years. The space shuttle fleet was grounded for 32 months. 7 crew members had been lost. Krista McAuliffe, selected through NASA's Teacher in Space project, had made the mission unusually visible, including to school children watching the launch live in classrooms across the country. Roger Boisjoly testified before the Rogers Commission. He later described experiencing professional marginalization within the organization after speaking publicly about the pre-launch teleconference. He eventually left Morton Thiokol. The organization retained its NASA contract, a deliberate decision, contingent on a full redesign of the booster joint and sealing system. That the same contractor remained in place after its management had overruled its own engineers was a complexity the program had to navigate carefully and publicly. NASA's leadership underwent significant restructuring. The Office of Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance was strengthened and granted greater independence. A NASA safety reporting system was introduced to improve the flow of concerns through the organization. Earlier ambitions for a high-cadence launch schedule, with some projections reaching as many as 24 missions per year, were permanently abandoned. The Challenger investigation changed how engineers, safety professionals, and organizational researchers think about institutional risk. The normalization of deviance, the gradual process by which repeated near misses become redefined as acceptable outcomes, entered the vocabulary of engineering, business schools, and safety management curricula worldwide. It is now studied wherever complex systems operate under sustained institutional pressure. The investigation demonstrated something that extended well beyond aerospace. Technical systems do not fail in isolation. They fail inside organizations. And organizations carry their own failure modes, hierarchies that suppress dissent, cultures that reward schedule over safety, and decision processes that lose contact with ground-level technical reality. What happened next changed industry thinking about the relationship between engineering authority and management authority in high-stakes environments. And then, 17 years later, the Space Shuttle Columbia was lost during re-entry. Investigators again identified organizational culture, the suppression of engineering concerns, the normalization of known risks, as a central contributing factor. The Rogers Commission had warned that hardware was not the vulnerability. Columbia confirmed it. The Challenger disaster is sometimes remembered as a story about an O-ring. That framing misses almost everything important about it. The O-ring failed because cold temperatures reduced its effectiveness. That is the engineering fact. But the engineering fact does not explain why 7 people died that morning. They died because a system designed to surface and act on safety concerns failed to do so at the critical moment. They died because the people who knew the most about the risk had the least authority to stop the launch. They died because an organization had spent years treating good outcomes as proof of acceptable risk, when those outcomes were, in part, simply good fortune running out slowly. The Rogers Commission asked NASA to examine not just the hardware, but the culture, because the investigation established something that remains deeply relevant to any complex organization operating today. The most dangerous warnings are not the ones that go undetected. They are the ones that are heard, documented, filed, and then overruled. Every system operating at high stakes carries its own version of that teleconference. The question is whether the organization has built structures that allow the warning to reach the people who can act on it, and whether those people have the institutional courage to listen. The Challenger investigation remains one of the most studied cases of institutional failure in the history of engineering and organizational management. Its lessons have never been more relevant. Which system today do you think is most vulnerable to the same pattern, warnings that exist but cannot travel far enough? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to understand how complex systems fail, not just what breaks, but why the structures around them allow it, subscribe to Null Theory. Every documentary on this channel starts with the same question: what hidden weakness inside the system allowed this to happen? The answers are always more complicated and more important than they first appear.